Hi, this is Paul. I got a lot of interesting comments, some pushback from my Blue Church War in the Heavens Birthing Spirits into the Estuary video that I released Thursday, June 17. And again, I'm very appreciative to the comments. I try and read as many as I can. I don't necessarily answer a lot in the comment thread in terms of a lot of text. I know sometimes people get a little frustrated if I just put a little heart in, but that lets me know that I responded to it and I can find it again. But I had never really heard much of anything about Michael Malice. Some of you were really happy that I addressed him the way I did. Others of you thought maybe I was uninformed, and I'll certainly admit to being not very informed about him. I haven't listened to any other videos or video interviews of him. So I'm very open to your pushback and to your thoughts. And in fact, today, when we had our usual Bridges of Meaning question and answer, part of the reason I like doing that question and answer on the Discord is I would like to have it be less just Paul answering questions. Well, maybe if I didn't give such long answers, it'd be less of that. And more opportunity for conversation. So I thought Sam and Nate Heil and Jacob and others gave some really good comments in there, and you can listen to some of those comments in the recording of that. But this morning, even before the question and answer, I thought maybe I should spend a little bit more time with that video because there are a few other things that I noted that I really wanted to talk about. I want to begin with an earlier segment of the video where basically the move is to deplore elites who call others deplorables. In other words, I see you hating me and I'll hate you back, or something of that nature. Now, again, maybe I'm being unfair. And so if there's a video of, I'm sure he has tons of comment. If there's a Michael Malice video out there that you think I should take a look at, I can't promise I'll see all of them. I don't know how much interest I have in hunting him down. You can only pursue so many videos. But if there's a video that seems to really capture him, especially those of you, one of you said, I'm a super fan. Well, if you're a super fan of him, drop in the comment section some of your very favorite moments of him so that I can give him a fair hearing. Because, of course, my commentary is based on my very limited understanding of him based on this conversation that he had with Jordan Peterson. Now, I really enjoyed the beginning of this video with the talk about trolling and understanding how trolling is in some ways jujitsu because you use the strength and practice of your opponent against themselves. And if they've got, it's easy to do this online because so many of the conversations are so anonymous. You can basically expect if I dangle this in front of this person, this is what they will say, and this is what they will do, and this is how they will respond. And once I understand this mechanism, how they are in that way, in terms of who they are, sort of a non-player character, I can do this in such a way as to embarrass them, marginalize them, put them into a corner, make them look like a fool on public display, and therefore discredit and disclaim, what's going on. And, that's a game. It's not necessarily a bad game. It's part of how we have public conversations. But you have to ask, is it a loving game? Now, I'm not saying it can't be, but that's really the standard, especially if you're a Christian. Because isn't part of the thrill of trolling the man, the person in charge, the person with power? And, one of the themes I hear from this is that this is very much a sense of there's an asymmetry. We talked about the blue state. They have the power. I don't have power. So I'm going to use this method to take power away from them. Now, again, as I think Peterson indicated a bit, there are some similarities in terms of this game as there is in the woke game, because they're both parasitic in the sense that they feel themselves the underdog, and the asymmetry in power justifies this action against them. So you really haven't disrupted the game of winning and losing. And in this anarchism, there's also sort of a radical egalitarianism. I mean, that mic drop moment about 1 hour in where basically, it's all, any of this cooperation is oppression. That's a radical, anti-hierarchical, egalitarian vision, which, again, is in many ways similar to the woke. There's a lot in common, and Peterson points that out in this video. And it's still about winning and losing, but it's about winning by another means, partly because, again, your opponent has more power, and so you find ways to use the power that you have to be victorious over your opponent. In many ways, you're weaponizing the morality of your opponent against himself or herself. And because so much of these discourses are so morally strident, I mean, there's a deep moralism at play in both of these movements. And so what you, in a sense, do is you weaponize your opponent's morality against them. So let's listen to some more of this video, and really, again, I thought it was quite interesting.
Can be put in their lap. So they used to, what 4chan would be known for is, for example, you had a Mountain Dew, right? And they had named the next flavor of Mountain Dew. It's just a corporate mechanism. I talk about this in the book. It's a corporate mechanism to sell, your sugary soft drink. What name should we call it?
And, quite rightly, there's definitely something disingenuous about the corporation in something like this. It is the corporation. Any attempt to weaponize the desires of your opponent and use them against them is in a certain way demonic. Think about it that way. And I use that word very carefully and don't over push it. But if you read something like, for example, the Screwtape Letters, that's basically how the devils work. Take a desire, use it to dangle in front of them, and because the goal of a contest like this is obviously to sell more soft drinks, but it's also to get your email so that they can continue to spam up your inbox.
And they basically got enough people together, and this is kind of like rent seeking, right? If you have an organized goal-seeking minority as opposed to an indifferent majority, that organized goal-seeking minority is going to be able to punch very much above its weight.
And that's genius. That's one way to sort of turn the tables on a power differential, let's say, and have victory over your opponent.
In terms of getting the achievements it wants. How many people are caring about this Mountain Dew poll? Very, very few, other than the trolls. So they got the number one result to be Hitler did nothing wrong, right? Now, they're not Nazis. They don't think the Holocaust is something that didn't happen or is bad. They're putting now this Mountain Dew, who's trying to use this fun to sell you this poisonous, sugary garbage. Now the corporation is in position. Are they going to follow through with this poll? Or are they going to pull it? Whatever they choose.
And now again, using Hitler did nothing wrong, in a sense, weaponizes the assumed moral position in society against the corporation. I mean, it's a brilliant scheme. If you're not a subscriber to The Rest is History, they just had a 2-part series on Hitler, and I thought it was very well done, and it was fascinating. But again, this is just genius stuff of, in many ways, people who are sort of in some dimensions on the underclass, and they want to turn the tables.
Jews, they have been forced into making a choice that they themselves would not have wanted, because you have someone in a meeting trying to, hey, this is going to be fun for the kids. And they ended up pulling the poll because they're like, okay, the internet won. So
the internet won. That is a very interesting little tell, because what for him is the internet? What is the internet an icon of? I talked about data. narrative icon. The internet won. So I'm not going to say what, but who is the internet? And again, the vision was that the internet is a radical egalitarian space, but a determined few can have victory over the apathetic many. What does that mean the internet is?
To go from that and this kind of extreme distrust, if not contempt, for corporate irreverence and corporate humor and corporate fun, to have...
Okay, and so you've got distrust, contempt for corporate, and again, I mean, fair enough. But again, see the last video, this corporation is something, and even the name, it's a corpus, it's a body. There's a mind, there's a will. It's not embodied in an individual. It's not embodied in a person. In fact, anyone who works for this corporation must in one way or submit themselves to it. Now, again, by virtue of this, any corporation is evil. I'd be curious what kind of organization Michael Malice has around him. Now, he might say, well, but everyone around me, there's no coercion in people working for me. Are they volunteers? Now, my relationship with Rick, there's no coercion or very, very little coercion that I can imagine. Maybe Rick will, if you, to the degree that you believe Rick is real. Rick comes on Fridays and Sundays to help. And we do so joyfully. And I think an anarchist would say, well, that's exactly the kind of relationship we would have. And I agree, because coercion is problematic, to use that problematic word. But this sort of, again, both what I'm hearing here, and if I'm wrong, leave a comment and leave me a link with a clip so that I can have a fair hearing. Both Malice and the woke have a degree of purificationism in them. Because there is some coercion in a corporation, but there's almost always coercion even in fairly healthy structures. I talked about secularism as sort of a bright cloud. With human beings in this dispensation, again, I'm a Calvinist, it's always cloudy. We're not pure. We can't be pure. It's not, this world cannot host purity, not for very long. And in fact, various forms of purity, it's in that sense easier to purify evil than good. One of the things that Jordan Peterson says often, which I think is deeply true, it can almost always be worse. It's almost always easier to make things worse than better. And so in a sense, this whole strategy is about making things worse. Now, in the name of making things better, and maybe it will, but that is in many ways what the type of coercion that is being used by corporations do. They say, you're going to sacrifice, and again, this gets into another deep theme of Peterson's, which actually, if they talk again, I hope they bring up. Because the whole idea of sacrifice is, I am going to self-tyrannize to a degree in order to set up something better moving forward. Now, if that dynamic itself is evil, it's very difficult to imagine how there can be any good or any life in this world. Because to one degree or another, parents are coerced by their infants. They do so freely. And again, that freedom is really important. And Peterson is also right in terms of when he talks about it is the freely chosen sacrifice, which is the one that is efficacious. God loves a cheerful giver. So this is an enormously complex set of dynamics that I feel, for the most part, he's making a simplistic case. Well, fair enough. It's difficult to make a nuanced case. And if you make a simplistic case and you make it in a dramatic way, as he's obviously very clever to do, well, nuance is the victim.
Basically, can I curse? on this?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay, well, not everything. So
They're both right.
to have someone who was basically a shit poster on Twitter running for president, who was just there in these debates, insulting these politicians to their face in often very below the belt terms, that was that ethos brought to life, because no one could have imagined in decades that you would have a presidential contender who's looking at a sitting senator in the face, who's doing well in the polls, and telling that senator, I've never made fun of your looks, and there's plenty of material there. Believe me, that much I can tell you. You know, this is something that was completely unprecedented and new, and we've been taught for decades.
Now, that's actually an extremely important point and a very compelling case that regardless of how Trump thought about himself, and maybe he does think about himself in these terms, and he very well might, he is in many ways an anarchist. And he was, at least ever since the 20th and 21st century, the first anarchist president. And he's not there to, he's there to destroy the system. And that, in fact, the moral panic that was awakened by him in the Blue Church, well, that was exactly what the panic was about. He's there to destroy the system. But now this coarsening of public discord, you have to ask, is it helpful? Now, so what if Rosie O'Donnell is fat and Lindsey Graham seems to be a sycophant and Joe Biden is getting up in years and Rubio is little and Ted Cruz, on and on and on and on and on and on. You can always poke fun at people. And doing so, what we've seen might be a big part of you getting elected for president of the United States. And I think Malice rightly points out that a big part of Trump's election was many people just saying, I don't believe in the system, and this is how I can register my vote against the system. Tear it down. We could see a very similar thing with Caitlyn Jenner's campaign in California. And on one hand, I understand that. On the other hand, I've got real questions as to, is this finally productive in a world where there's much, in fact, I would say too much residing on the state? Now maybe your plan is to make the state smaller by having a candidate like this come in and destroy things, and maybe fair enough. Maybe states need to be perpetually trimmed. They really do. So do churches. Almost any corporation or institution needs to be perpetually trimmed. And corporations and institutions have a life cycle, and they tend to grow and they tend to get bloated, and sometimes they need to die. But when you're talking the death of something as old as the state, the federal government of the United States, its death would be a very bloody affair. And where it goes, who knows? So if you read, I should pull up this book. I found Timothy Snyder's Black Earth to be a very compelling read. And what he asserts is part of what there's another book that he wrote that I read before, Bloodlands. They're both brutal books because they're written about, this period between the Soviet Union and Germany in the 30s and 40s. And he makes the case that, and I find it to be a good case, that what Nazism tried to do was destroy institutions. And that's fitting with Nazi ideology because it was very much a radical environmentalism. It was very green. Tom Holland points this out in his Dillingpod interview that you can find after, when Tom was talking about Dominion. That the Soviets would come in and they very much wanted to build institutions and increase the power of the state. And the Nazis very much wanted to destroy institutions, because the idea was that if you destroy institutions, the natural Darwinian process of the strong taking the weak would in fact improve the race. And so in these areas where it would continually change hands between the Soviets and the Nazis, Poland especially, the Soviets come in and they, now we're going to build all this totalitarian, tyrannic, communist apparatus. And then the Germans come over and they're like, we're going to take everything apart. And if we take all the institutions apart, it's sort of like, well, then suddenly naturalism will bloom and we'll destroy all of these institutions. And if we destroy all of these institutions, then a radical freedom will emerge. But in that radical freedom, the wolf eats the lamb. Now, one might say, well, that's how nature works, and fair enough. But would you like me to haul you out of your living room and plump you naked in the Serengeti without the producers of Naked and Afraid? Is that what you really want? Because part of humanity's superpower is we do build institutions, and these institutions are built so that sacrifice can be productive and not simply predatory. And part of the Nazi vision was, if you release people to be exactly who they are, and part of the reason that they disliked the Jews were because they saw the Jews as basically constructing ideology and institutions upon humanity, which of course led up to, in many ways, at least as a Christian, you would say the greatest Jew of all, who was Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the Nazis' relationship with Christianity was very interesting, and there are books about that as well. But, when Tom Holland says that Nazism is in some ways a radical environmentalism, yeah, because you want to get rid of all of these institutions. And if that happens, then according to the Nazis, well, humanity will continue to evolve in a natural way. And all of the disruption that we have been doing in between by establishing these institutions which interrupt the disruption go away. And so therefore, in very social Darwinian terms that were very popular at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, which basically died a death because of the calamity of Nazi Germany, this social Darwinism, will simply flourish, and the truly great humanity will arise. And in order for this to happen, weak humanity needs to go. Now, I don't know what Michael Malice's vision of true humanity is, but it's not in agreement with Peterson. It's not in agreement with me. I think Peterson is an Augustinian and doesn't know it. And I'm going to touch on that at the end of this video when I play a portion where it seems Michael Malice seems very kind and generous about the individual. But I think he's naive in terms of what it takes for individuals to thrive. And he finds intersection with Peterson that institutions can become tyrannical. But Peterson disagrees with him by saying institutions are also necessary, as are hierarchies.
That politics should be about respect. These are tough choices. These are people's lives. That's all very true. But there's this very new left from the late 60s perspective idea that these kind of powerful entities use respect and decorum and decency as a mechanism to stifle dissent and to basically make their victory a fait accompli.
And if I heard someone, let's say that Benjamin Boyce put on his channel, making this as an argument for systemic racism, that is exactly what they would say. And that is exactly what they would say about the right. And so the commonality I hear coming out of his mouth with the other side is dramatic.
And if you kind of mess that up and force them to show their hand that these are not kind, caring people who care about your grandma in your neighborhood. These are power-hungry sociopaths who will smile at your face and do whatever they need to when the lights are off. That, I think, was something that was very useful in terms of exposing our politics for what they are.
Compare what he just said to something like this.
Welcome back to Black News Tonight. I'm still here with Dr. Aruna Kilanani as we talk exclusively about her content of her virtual talk, The Psychopathic Problem of the White Mind. Before we talk about the kind of consequences there of your speech, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you said in the speech that I thought were interesting and compelling. You said, this is the cost of talking to white people. The cost of your own life as they suck you dry. There are no good apples out there. White people make my blood boil. When you say that,
this kind of rhetoric does not sound inconsistent with what I hear from Malice.
there are no good apples out there, what kind of claim are you making?
I'm talking about people have this idea that racism is something that if you're consciously racist or if you're a Klan member. And
then Malice basically says, well, this is how they really are. Are they conscious of it? Because I think there are other views of these people, some of whom I know. I don't think they're conscious of it. Oh, no, but this is what's going on. This is what happens when you inhabit a corporation and it takes you over and it makes you this kind of person. Again, this is exactly what we're hearing from the other side.
I'm sort of making the claim that racism is something that is unconscious and it is actually in everyone. And everyone uses these words systemic. They're like, you know, I know that racism is systemic, and yet individually, when you call them out, they'll be like, well, it's not me. You can't say that. And so there's a disconnect between use of the word systemic and saying that racism is everywhere. But the moment you point it out individually, there's sort of people disown their own violence and racism.
Would it be fair to say, based on your expertise, that white people are psychopathic?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's many lies that, and didn't get to that part because what I've delivered was only part of a first series of talks. But the level of lying that white people do that has started since colonialism, we're just used to it.
And I think you could hear this from Malice.
Such as every time you. Sure. Every time that you steal a country, you loot, you say you've discovered something. I mean, this level of lie is actually part of history. We don't say that we killed all these people, we got rid of all the Native Americans. We say we discovered America. You don't talk about the level of death. You don't talk about the level of what actually occurred. You wipe the slate clean, you sanitize the violence, and you actually got lost along the way. You're trying to go to India, and then you say you discovered something. And this level of discovery is everywhere. You've discovered vegetarianism. You know, you've discovered yoga. You've discovered everything is a discovery, and it's all actually stolen.
So what you're talking about at this point is a kind of macro level, systemic, structural kind of thing. But you're also trained to think about the psyche, which is about the individual at a certain level.
Absolutely.
To what extent can we say that individual white people are psychopathic or unhealthy or out of their minds? I'm using this language for those who are watching. I'm using this language based on what was in the speech and based on other work that's been published. This isn't necessarily my personal opinion. It's the analysis here. Do you think, to what extent can we say that individual white people are this thing versus saying that there's a culture of theft, a culture of colonialism? And is there a useful distinction to be made between the two?
I think people, there is a useful distinction to be made. And on one level, yes, that's absolutely true. And you know, it's different than actual individual psychopathy, the way that people conceive of it. On another level, when we are thinking about individual responsibility and how it is that people change, I think that using the words systemic and there's a culture operate defensively to not actually let yourself go into your own unconscious and go into those dark places of what you're actually doing. So I'm actually talking about it sort of as a defensive structure, like not acknowledging that on an individual level, I think can operate as a defense.
And again, when I listen to something like this, I think it's basically Malice and her are doing kind of the same thing, kind of making the same argument, which is also basically the kind of stuff that James Lindsay keeps pointing out.
Look at the word critical here. What does the word critical mean? The word critical means, in this context, looking at in extreme closeness, analyzing particularly the use of language, history, etc., in order to make problems related specifically to oppression more visible so that people will want to enact a revolution to overturn the power dynamics that are alleged to be a part of it.
And I think that's exactly what Malice is saying. When I hear him, I hear this stuff. So again, leave a comment with a clip that might clarify this for me. I'm happy to see it, but that's what I hear.
So it struck me over the last decade or so that the alignment of comedic satire with right-wing philosophy or political philosophy or views was something that was completely unprecedented. I thought, well, all of a sudden the right wing are the jesters, or at least among the right wing are these jesters. And I really didn't know what to make of that. I mean, you seem to regard it in your book, The New Right, you seem to regard it as a kind of right-wing anarchic rebellion against, but it's strange what they're against, because on the one hand, there's the corporate voice, let's say, that characterizes the media, and on the other hand, there's the left-wing progressives, and you can't really put them in the same camp all that easily.
Well, hopefully we will be putting them in the same camp. But they are in the same camp because one of my quotes is conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. So much of conservatism, Buckley got his start, William F. Buckley, who's I think the big villain of the book, got his start complaining how terrible things are and how mistreated he was at Yale. The New Right perspective isn't complaining about how things are at Yale. It's let's send tanks to Harvard Yard and raze it to the ground. So
I don't think he means that literally. But I can't say I'm sure he doesn't. That's a dramatic thing to say.
These are two different approaches. And
now remember that video that I just played of that interview, this woman got attention because she basically said she wants to put a gun to the head of white people. This guy's talking about sending in tanks to Harvard Yard. Again, I listened to this. I'm just listening. That's what he said. Now, I think it's helpful to bring Orwell into this because Peterson is a big fan of George Orwell. And in many ways, a lot of these issues that we're visiting had been visited in the 1920s and 30s. There's a great courses series on Audible about George Orwell, which I really enjoyed. I listened to it not too long ago. Now, and so Peterson's critique Peterson has basically been following Orwell in this, and Peterson deals with Orwell in his classes. Orwell noted that many of these individuals loved the power they generated by speaking in favor of the beleaguered masses. And that dynamic continues. And I think Malice is right about that. I have often seen that a lot of the money that the state uses to try to address social issues mostly benefits those who supply services to those people. Because I talked about the fact that one of the big lessons I took out of living and working in the third world is that it's tremendously difficult to help a human being. It's also difficult to help groups of human beings. It's tremendously difficult. And so I think many do so with well-meaning intentions, but what happens, in fact, is often ineffective and sometimes ruinous. Now, Orwell was a believer in the small, and there's wisdom in there. The difficulty with that is sometimes we also need the large, and the small is sort of, when the small works, it's usually because there is a degree of self-tyranny rather than tyranny from above. But the self-tyranny, if it comes in a healthy way, usually happens because of a parental tyranny from above that comes in, and it often comes in religious ways. And this is something that I think, the new atheist completely missed, was that there's tyranny all through these systems, but you need a bit of it, but you can't have too much of it. And I think this comes, and it only works well when the actual orientation is love. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So Orwell noted that many of these individuals loved the power they generated by speaking in favor of the beleaguered masses. Demagoguery, we have a word for it. And many tyrannical rulers have risen to power. Hitler did so based on the grievances against the Versailles Treaty. Stalin, and they drove to power. You can do that. People are susceptible to this. And when a system doesn't work for people, sometimes they're right, they say, I'd be better off without that system at all. And that's part of the reason why sometimes systems need to go away and things need to be dismantled. But when, where, and how, it takes tremendous wisdom. Notice that there's a subtle Christian assumption at play beneath the beleaguerment of the masses. I mean, that's nearly sheep without a shepherd that you can find from the Hebrew prophets. And the condemnation of the Hebrew leaders goes back to the Bible. You can find it in something like Jeremiah 23. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to the shepherds who tend my sheep, to tend my people. Because you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not bestowed care on them, I will bestow punishment on you for the evil you have done, declares the Lord. I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all of the countries where I have driven them and bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. I will place shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. Days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteous Savior. So then the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives who brought the Israelites out of Egypt, but they will say, as surely as the Lord lives who brought the descendants of Israel out of the lands of the north and out of the countries where he has banished them. They will live in their own land. And there are numbers of passages just like this in the Bible that, the shepherds are not doing what they're supposed to, and God himself is going to judge them. And God will give them a king, a shepherd. But this isn't a banishment of shepherding. Now, this is an extremely complex dynamic because there are sort of two traps to fall into. You can demonize the elites and the unjust shepherds of the sheep who are fleecing the flock and living the wealth of the elites at the expense of the masses. Or you can idolize the masses. And notice that the book of Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel and the other Hebrew prophets that talk about this don't idolize the masses, because part of what we've seen is this pattern in our culture. Now, I wanted to bring in Theodore Dalrymple's book Life at the Bottom, because with Dalrymple, who was just on Peterson's channel, you get this interesting mix, because Dalrymple also complains about a culture that has developed at the bottom. And I'll read some of the introduction of this. Let's see if we can get there. Here we go. A specter is haunting the Western world, the underclass. This underclass is not poor, at least by the standards that have prevailed throughout the great majority of human history. It exists to varying degree in all Western societies. Like every other social class, it has benefited enormously from the vast general increase in wealth of the past 100 years. In certain respects, indeed, it enjoys amenities and comforts that would have made a Roman emperor or an absolute monarch gasp. Nor is it politically oppressed. It fears neither to speak its mind nor the midnight knock at the door. And I think this is part of a weakness in Malice's approach as well. Yet, its existence is wretched nonetheless, with a special wretchedness that is peculiarly its own. Part of what you might see both in the overreach of, let's say, the woke, and at least what I hear in Malice, and again, if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me below, is sort of a catastrophizing of those who have legitimately suffered at the hands of others. And again, if you read Jonathan Haidt, Peterson references Jonathan Haidt a number of times in that interview. In Jonathan Haidt's latest book, this catastrophizing of the situation actually doesn't help anyone. And in many ways, what Dalrymple points out is that the underclass has, in effect, sort of weaponized many of the things that have been used against them, and they themselves are suffering because of it. And this book is basically a catalog of that. As a doctor who has worked for the past decade in a busy general hospital in a British slum, and also in a nearby prison, I have been in a privileged position to observe the life of the underclass. I have, for example, interviewed some 10,000 people who have made an attempt, however feeble, at suicide, each of whom have told me of the lives of 4 or 5 other people around them. From this source alone, I would have learned about the lives of 50,000 people, lives dominated almost without exception by violence, crime, and degradation. Now, it's difficult for me to believe that if you would somehow relieve all of these people of any coercive institutions, even loving coercive institutions, that suddenly everything would come up roses. It's about as fantastical a belief as a lot of the anti-racist stuff I hear coming from the wokest around. My sample is a selected one, no doubt, as all samples drawn from personal experience must be, but it is not small. Moreover, having previously worked as a doctor in some of the poorest countries in Africa, as well as in very poor countries in the Pacific and Latin America, I have little hesitation in saying that the mental, cultural, emotional, and spiritual impoverishment of the Western underclass is the greatest of any large group of people I have ever encountered anywhere. As a doctor, I am, of course, committed to treat each patient as an individual. It could hardly be otherwise. When you talk to people about the most intimate details of their lives, it could scarcely occur to you that they are other than fully conscious agents, in essence, no different from yourself. And this, I think, gets into another weakness of Malice's position, imagining that somehow relieving the burden of any kind of, I should find exactly the quote that he used. I don't want to take the time to look it up right now. I'm already running late and should get home. And any institution, whether it be formal like a corporation that has stockholders, or implicit like let's say a marriage, which you may get into the marriage voluntarily, but if you're married for any length of time, there will come a day that you imagine, I'm not sure this was a good idea. And the tyranny of that marriage weighs on you and impinges on you because you're going to have to say no to yourself in order to achieve something else, which in that moment might not be something you really want. And it's those kinds of issues that Dalrymple mostly points out and points to in terms of the poverty. In fact, what he shows is that in some ways, and this is where talking about this gets extremely difficult, you need the right amount of coercion, both external and internalized, in order to actually flourish. And again, I really wish Peterson had, but no, I think he's doing well with his interviews. But if Peterson, let's say, were to do a video critiquing Malice, the work Peterson has done on sacrifice, I think, is central to this, as is, let's say, the work that René Girard does in terms of how Christianity takes in this really vigorous self-critique and perpetuates it. And so in that way, both the woke who are similar to Malice and Malice actually reinstantiate that Christian self-critique in this. But without sort of a fully rounded religious container that something like Christianity offers, Malice himself, I fear, can become some kind of an ideology. Nevertheless, patterns of behavior emerge in the case of the underclass, almost entirely self-destructive ones. And again, in my experience with what Dalrymple is talking about, it is the inability of family structures and individuals to say no to themselves that causes these self-destructive patterns. Day after day, I hear of the same violence, the same neglect and abuse of children, the same broken relationships, the same victimization by crime, the same nihilism, the same dumb despair. Is everyone a unique individual? How do patterns such as this emerge? Well, these are the spirits among us. They are the principalities that are working their way through. Economic determinism of the vicious cycle of poverty variety seems hardly to answer the question. Not only is the underclass not poor, but untold millions of people who were very much poorer have emerged from poverty within living memory. In South Korea, for example, if being poor really entails a vicious cycle, man would still be living in the caves. Genetic or racial determinism is no better. It will come as a surprise to American readers, perhaps, to learn that the majority of the British underclass is white. Actually, the majority of the American underclass is white too. It's not black. There certainly is a black underclass, and its population is certainly significant, but a lot of the very well-meant attempts to rescue that underclass, which usually comes from white folks, of which I think a lot of this wokeism is a reiteration of, still the majority of poor people in America are white. Genetics, moreover, can hardly explain such a phenomena as the rise of mass illegitimacy, unprecedented in recorded history since the late 1950s. The role of the welfare state in the rise, if that is quite the word for it, of the underclass is likewise overstressed. At most, it might have been a necessary condition for that rise. It made it possible, but not inevitable. Welfare states have existed for substantial periods of time without the development of a modern underclass. An added ingredient is obviously necessary. This ingredient is to be found in the realm of ideas. Human behavior cannot be explained without reference to the meaning and intentions people have given their acts and omissions. And everyone has a Weltanschauung, I can't speak German, a worldview, whether he knows it or not. That's a religion W, I would say. It is the ideas my patients have that fascinate and, to be honest, appall me, for they are the source of their own misery. Their ideas have made themselves manifest, and they do so freely. It's a principality in many ways that they are bound to, but they participate in it freely. And again, it's finding the verbal models to talk about these nuanced dynamics that's incredibly difficult. And we sort of wait for the logos to appear so we can have the words to say. The frequent locutions of passivity is a striking example. An alcoholic explaining his misconduct while drunk will say, "The beer went mad." Must be an English expression. A heroin addict explaining his resort to the needle will say, "Heroin's everywhere," as if the beer drank the alcoholic and the heroin injected the addict. In some ways, that's true. And I've got my own critique of Dalrymple. But because our systems don't tend to be able to afford the kind of communal spirits, principalities and powers, but demonic spirits, we may say, that possess us in a rather peculiar way. Religious language tends to have that faculty, whereas modern therapeutic language really struggles. Other locutions plainly serve as exculpatory function and represent a denial of agency and therefore of personal responsibility. The murderer claims the knife went in or the gun went off. The man who attacks his sexual consort claims that he went into one or lost it. As it were, as if he were the victim of a kind of epilepsy of which it is the doctor's duty to cure him. Until the cure, of course, can continue to abuse his consort, for such abuse has certain advantages for him, safe in the knowledge that he, not his consort, is its true victim. And so, again, I don't find malice helpful because I don't think he engages what a human being is and what we are in community. It seems to run the risk of devolving because of a certain individualism that doesn't recognize we are not merely individual organisms discreetly contained by our skin. We are, in fact, a living communities, and we think together. We have, to one degree or another, extremely susceptible and may be benefited from a certain capacity as a hive mind. Now, what we're doing here is practicing some sort of relevance realization, as John Vervaeke would say. And I think, again, well, as a Christian, my answer is love. But love is not fundamentally a romanticism. Love is a difficult, painful sacrifice for the welfare of another, which, by virtue of communities such as churches, we try to do so for others. And I'm not saying that only church people do this by any means. In fact, if you get into the question and answer that I had today, a big part of what I'm wondering about is, in fact, the limits of Protestant confessionalism, by which we try to demarcate a lot of things. And in some ways, the Western world continues as a Christendom. It's because of our history of confessional Protestantism, we don't recognize it as such. Loving involves 1,000 facile inconsistencies in service of relevance realization. A good parent knows this. Grade school children, especially when they get up into the middle school years, are remarkably adept at sniffing out fairness. And they will very quickly point out that good parents treat their children differently, sometimes in an abusive way, but a good parent will do so in a helpful way. And the child will say, you said yes to this person for this, and yes to my sibling for this, and no to me. That's unfair. You should always give us the same answer. And the wise parent will say, you're not the same person as your sibling, and I will give you what you need. That's what love requires. And I will say no to you. That's what love requires. And Dalrymple knows that. You can't, it's this facile, shallow, romanticized image of love. And by all means, I, in fact, was having a private conversation yesterday with someone I hope to have on this channel in the future, because he's got a lot of wisdom and he works with a community that is struggling tremendously, and his occupation is to try to help them. And we both pull at our hair often at government institutions that try to help, and in the process do a tremendous amount of damage. And as Orwell noted, and as Malice noted, and as Peterson noted, what happens is even the people who are well-meaning, and maybe they're not well-meaning, there's something called donor resentment in a lot of these bad relationships, where the people who receive begin to resent the donor, and the donor begins to resent the people under them. And if you worked in a welfare office, or if you work in a mental health facility, or if you're a police officer, because this happens to cops all the time, it's tremendously difficult not to see patterns and build resentment and begin to dehumanize the people you work with and are there to serve. And the only remedy of that is love. But part of what we do is in these institutions is we depersonalize it. And this is part of the reason why, if you listen to Nate, and if you listen to some in the Bridges of Meaning community that talk about their Christian anarchism, and I think what Sam said, you can find it in the question and answer section where it's the first question. And I agree with Sam that, and I couldn't have said it better than he said it, that this is sort of hey, I can play the video, can't I? Sounds like a sort of radical egalitarianism, but in a Christian context where there is a definite arche and a definite hierarchy and in many ways a monarchy, there's tension in there. So Nate, maybe you can comment a little bit on what you see as Christian anarchism.
Okay, I'll have to make this somewhat brief because I'm actually in the middle of a work email. But essentially,
There
it
are
has
priorities.
essentially it has to do with the concept of autarky, like self-rulership, right? Well, to be honest with you, from my perspective, only the Christian is actually capable of being a real anarchist, because only a Christian is capable of true autarky, because the only path to true autarky is in union with Christ. And that's really the core of it. And it's really, in terms of Joey, yes, it's very much a practice. It's just like, it's the secular version of it that is closest to the Christian idea of it is kind of like Moldbug's, like living like a, like an expatriate in your home nation kind of idea. It's like, you belong to another kingdom, so why should you care about this nonsense? It's not going to it's actually going to keep you away from the path of true autarky that only comes through submission and conforming to the image of Christ. I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense. Boy, it sure sounds like an Anabaptist position, though. So I haven't had a chance to see your conversation with Luke and with Julian, but seeing Julian in that mix really made me think of Anabaptism. And of course, Luke is, gosh, how to summarize Luke? I mean, he's sort of this free. And again, I mean, this is from, and part of the beauty of trying to develop a community where we know each other is we know each other, and our conversations have context, and it's necessary. The constraint is necessary for productivity, and I think that goes all the way up. Orthodoxy and element. Thank you so much. I'm here just for the comments on relating. It was a fair pushback. I really like what you just said, Nate. Natural law. And I should get to Sam. I'll just stop recording until I find Sam. And here's where Sam cut in.
One of the Reformed zealots can I say something quickly, Paul, if you don't mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that when I'm listening to Christian anarchists talk, what they're really just saying is something more like Christian pacifism. It's not like they don't believe in authority and hierarchy. It's that they just don't believe that it should use force to stabilize itself and to accomplish its means.
Right.
And that it should be some sort of balance of persuasion from the top and healthy humility and submission, voluntary submission from the bottom. But that there's still hierarchy and cooperation, and there's still the monarchy of Jesus at the top. Whereas anarchists like the one that Peterson talked to, when he said that all cooperation was like tyranny or something like that, or all unity was oppression, basically, hard stop, that is just extremely anti-Christian. So I really think that maybe the Christian anarchists should pick a slightly different word, although it does do a good job of getting attention, but I don't think that's really what they mean.
I could. And this, again, is why I think love has to be what guides it. And this is where we use, my God number one, God number two, group A, group B, all of these little things that I've developed over the last 20 years, borrowing from Pascal, the spirit of finesse. And so with each individual, you employ the spirit of finesse, not the spirit of geometry. It's what's, you get frustrated with policy. Now, again, you sort of need policy, but it's always limited. One person said you can easily predict the conduct of a group of people, but it's a different thing to predict the conduct of an individual human being. Policy works to a degree with groups, but it always falls short with individuals. And so then you use the spirit of finesse, not the spirit of geometry. Love is your only guide, but love is not niceness. So I after the question and answer today, Rick and I went out for tacos, and we didn't have to wear a mask in a restaurant. That was kind of nice again. And he got me telling missionary stories because we were talking about this video and about malice. And Rick had said that he was just going to watch something, was just watching something on comparison of Haiti to the Dominican Republic. And this picture went around the internet. Why is Haiti so bare and the Dominican Republic continues to have trees? Well, the reason is because the Dominican Republic doesn't have a terrific government and by no means has a terrific judicial system. Anyone who lives there will probably recognize that the capacity of the police in the United States is far beyond what it is in the Dominican Republic, and it is far more just. Balaguer, who was, who was a strong man in the DR following Trujillo, once told the police, I know we don't have enough money to pay you, and we know you have to make up your money picking up tips on the street. The other word for tips are bribes. Well, anyway, the Dominican Republic, in all of its difficulty in establishing a just society, had laws about deforestation. Haiti is where they deforested the country because all the wood was cut down for charcoal for burning. And in the Dominican Republic, they had laws and they had reforestation programs, and they've been fairly effective. Now, sometimes it can get a little tyrannical. And in the Dominican Republic, if you wanted to hurt somebody, you'd make an accusation that they cut down a tree, and then you'd go and sit in jail for 2 or 3 days. And I would regularly see many of the Haitians that I worked with in the Foresta little prison right down in the little town that I lived in. And one of my friends who was working he was a manager for a shrimp farm owned by a Dominican, spent a few days there. And, it's kind of a Barney Fife operation there. And you got to go home to sleep at night and just show up by jail at 8 a.m. and spend your day in jail, sort of like jury duty and not getting called. It wasn't a particularly nice cell, but actually even my friend didn't have to sit in the cell, and whereas the Haitians all had to. And so, I'm no skeptic about racism or any of these things. But yet, what happens in Haiti is that, well, they didn't keep people from making charcoal out of trees. The Dominican Republic, they had a program to subsidize propane so that propane could actually compete and that poor people could get a stove. And it's, nicer to cook over propane. You can turn it on, you can turn it off. And the system worked fairly well. But I mentioned to Rick that, well, all of these systems have limitations. So once the government started subsidizing propane, it's fairly easy to convert a car to run on propane instead of gasoline. And so people started converting their cars to propane and using that subsidized propane. But now suddenly you're messing with, it's just always problematic. But yet, that level of tyranny, which would be pretty disappointing to most North Americans because it's more intrusive than a lot of the systems that we have, actually has managed to maintain and to retard deforestation in the Dominican Republic and not Haiti. So sometimes even a not great law working not very well is better than no law at all, because what are the Haitians going to do? They say, well, we as a people should have our consciousness raised and we're not going to use wood as charcoal for cooking anymore. Fat chance. It's going to take a structure, and there's going to be some coercion. Now, can it be too coercive? Yes. And figuring out the balance of that and all the complexity is very, very difficult. But just saying all that's tyranny, that's simply simplistic. And what's more troubling is the idealistic assumptions beneath about how human beings operate. I just have very little confidence in it. And again, if I'm being unfair, leave a comment, leave a link to a video, and I'll try to take a look at some of them. So now I want to be fair, because I thought the conversation ended very well. And I thought, Malice showed himself as someone who does care for people. And I know politicians. Sacramento is a political city. There are members of my church good number of members of my church have worked for state offices. My children have worked in the offices of assembly persons and state senators. So, and what I hear from many of the people that I know and trust is that often these are people trying to do good, but they're working within a principality. But again, there's no easy answers to any of this. But I think what shows up at the end of the video is really a loving thing. And Malice seems to want well and love the individual. But I don't think his system as a system works because, again, as Peterson points out repeatedly, well, I'm a university professor. Shouldn't I be the enemy? Well, not you. Well, that's sort of how we do it, isn't it? And I think Nate said very well, a personalism rather than an individualism, which is actually what he said when I was talking about Lord's Supper, or communion, or Eucharist in the question and answer.
Right, because you're using something that really is a tool for the good, let's say humor, and you're perverting it so that you're masking something awful. So that's analogous in some sense to this corporate malfeasance that you were discussing. And so I guess the sense I get when looking at the irreverence of these young
Peterson's looking good and healthier all the time. It's good to see.
Guys, essentially on 4chan, I think, just bloody well make sure.
If Jordan ever calls and wants to talk, I'll wear a coat.
You stay on the right side.
Even though my office today, it's 108 outside, and my office is 90 degrees. So, hey, it's, 20 degrees below the outside temperature in here. I shouldn't complain.
Funny. And there's always doubt in that, and maybe there has to be, but it's still the right moral imperative. It's like, go ahead with your humor, man, but like, watch your tongue. Like, watch your tongue.
It's also the idea of clapter, where you had all these comedians going after Trump or whoever, and the audience, instead of laughing, which is a visceral reaction, would applaud. And
again, I think that's a really helpful insight. And so listening to that, it's like, yeah, this guy's smart. He's given me insight. I can see value with listening to him, but I'm not buying his program. I haven't seen anything that would make me buy it.
It's like they don't think you're funny. They're agreeing with you. It's kind of like people whose favorite kind of music is like religious music. It's like you don't necessarily, which a lot of it is very good. A lot of Christian rock is very good. Don't get me wrong. They're very talented people. But do you like this song because you like the beat? Do you like how it makes you feel? Or do you like this song because you happen to agree with the person?
Well, with religious music, you not only have the power of the music, you leverage the power of religious formation that moves you.
Entirely different phenomenon.
Yes, well, there has to be an element of surprise and humor, right?
Yes.
Right?
Oh, yes.
And that also accounts for that spontaneous laughter, which is an indication that the arrow hit its mark, right? That the target is being specified properly and precisely, and it really is a form of art to do that. And so, well, then I think I always had mixed feelings about the satirists on 4chan for exactly that reason. It's like, well, are you really watching what you're saying carefully enough? Like, hooray for your humor, hooray for your courage, all of that.
But this is like the Steven Pinkers. In any population, you're going to have a small percentage who rise above, who are quality and that whatever it is at its best. And the vast majority of people bring nothing to the table. And then there's plenty of people who actually use that mechanism to make things much worse.
Right.
Well, there's an elitism in there, isn't there? He's not wrong. But again, how good is his system?
Well, and that's interesting as well, because it also, like, I always think, well, wouldn't it be great if there were only good restaurants? And then I think, well, wait a second, how many bad restaurants do there have to be in order for there to be one good restaurant? And the answer...
That's just a brilliant insight.
Isn't zero.
Yeah,
the answer is definitely some. because people have to practice and they have to make mistakes and they have to learn. And well,
Right.
And so you look at 4chan too, and you can think, well, how much wretched, humorless, racist noise do you have to tolerate in order to generate something of true value? And the answer to that is, I think two. One is we don't know. That's the first answer. And so beware of clamping down on it too precipitously. But the second is maybe...
And this point might also be made about institutions of constraint. How many of them do you need in order for the good ones to rise to the top?
That's also something that each of the people who are involved in that kind of activity should be attending to, within the confines of their own soul, so to speak. I mean, they're anonymous and it's evanescent, but that doesn't mean that you bear no moral responsibility for what you're saying.
Yes, and I think cruelty for the sake of cruelty is really a sign of weakness. It's the kid pulling the wings off of a bug, or putting tin cans on a cat's tail. It's a way for people to just feel some modicum of power over another human being. But that's a very parasitic way of looking at things, and using this other person as a means to an end. And this person might not be a great person, but really, what are you accomplishing? You're just both miserable now. There needs to be, in my view, a joyousness to what you're trying to do, and I certainly hope that permeates.
But not just a joyousness, it has to build something. And I think fundamentally, a lot of what I've heard from him is parasitic. It's the critique of tyrannical systems, but I don't know how much you can build.
Permeates my work and my output.
That's a good place to stop.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this.
So far, so good.
That's an interesting answer.
Such an honor. Thank you. Can I ask you do you have to bounce right now, or do you have time for one question?
I have time for a question.
In your absence, I've been kind of taking a lot of young men under my wing and kind of mentoring them. I saved one kid's life. When he reached out to me, he was suicidal, and now he's just kind of...
They're under your wing.
Has bad days, which that's all you need.
That's a lot better.
That bad days if you're not a threat to your life, whatever. What advice would you have to me or to your past self when this started happening for you? Because I'm very scared of saying the wrong thing and making things worse.
There's no way you can pay too much attention.
Okay.
Like ignorant attention. Watch the person. And you do that when you're in conversation, paying attention. More attention, and you can't offer advice in some sense. You have to listen.
Okay, yeah. Let them feel heard.
But if you pay attention, your good habits will take over, and you'll walk down the right course.
Okay.
So, humility and attention.
Much.
That's good. Humility and attention.
As I'm sure you've seen, it's amazing how many young people just want someone to listen to them, and it's just have someone that they respect, and once that happens, they feel so validated.
Yeah, well, they really want to say something.
And that's because of a status imbalance. See, C.S. Lewis has this lovely section in The Weight of Glory where he talks about the specific pleasure of the inferior. And there's no space in radical egalitarianism for that. And C.S. Lewis writes about that again in The Weight of Glory, which is just an amazing sermon. And it's true. And for human beings, and again, you need to have a God to understand that specific pleasure. So I like this close to the conversation, and maybe I'll snap this picture, because I'm always needing good pictures and thumbnails, and that's a nice one of both, because I don't want to have pictures of them that don't look good. Anyway, so yeah. Again, I want to be fair, and I won't have time to read Malice's book or do a deep dive into him. I'm mostly finding this here. But if there are videos on YouTube, because he's got plenty out there, I'm sure. And, you know, if you can leave the place in the conversation, you know how to do that with the link when you hit share on YouTube. And I can do that right here to show you. You hit share, and then it comes up, and then start at here and hit copy. You can put that in the comment, or you can put it on Twitter and at me. And because I want to be fair, but you know, there's this line that you walk. It's sort of opponent processing. You know, Jesus both says, do not judge and discern the spirits. And so we're always sort of walking that line of opponent processing. So I want to be fair. I want to get it right, but I want to give a good critique, because in the spirit of what, again, John Vervaeke calls dialogos, we both want to leave the conversation with more than we came. And it's not about my victory at your expense. It's about both of us learning from each other. So again, thanks for watching. And as Freddie said, I'll see you on the flip side.